Close your eyes for a second. And don't just do it casually. Actually notice what happens. Because the moment you shut off the visual world, something very peculiar remains. A feeling that you are still there. Still present, still located somewhere. And if I ask you where you are right now, you won't point to your chest or your hands or your feet. You'll say something like, I'm here. And by here, you mean somewhere behind your eyes. As if you are sitting in a dark control room inside your skull, looking out through two windows called eyes, watching the world unfold in front of you. And that feeling is so natural, so immediate, that it never even occurs to you to question it. It feels like the most obvious fact about existence, that you are inside your head, observing reality from behind your face. But let's slow that down, because the moment you stop taking it for granted, it starts to fall apart in a very unsettling way. Your eyes are not windows. They don't show you the world directly. They are detectors, physical devices made of cells that react to incoming photons, tiny packets of light that strike the retina and trigger chemical changes, which then get converted into electrical signals, and those signals travel backward, not forward, through the optic nerve into the visual cortex located at the back of your brain, not behind your eyes, not where you feel like you are, but in a completely different region of your skull, where there is no image, no screen, no little observer watching anything, just neurons firing in complex patterns. So now you have a strange situation. All the information about the world, everything you see, every color, every movement, every face is being processed in the back of your head. Yet you don't feel like you're back there. You feel like you're up front, right behind your eyes, looking outward. And that raises a very uncomfortable question that most people never ask. If the processing is happening in one place, why does the experience feel like it's happening somewhere else? And more importantly, who exactly is experiencing it? Because if you imagine a little you inside your head watching those signals like a movie, you've just created a problem that never ends. Because that little you would need its own eyes and its own brain to interpret what it sees. And inside that brain, there would have to be another little you, and so on forever. An infinite chain of observers, inside observers, which clearly makes no sense at all. What's actually happening is much stranger and much more interesting. Your brain is not showing a picture to anyone. It is constructing a model, a representation of the world based on incoming data, and within that model it places a reference point, a kind of you are here marker. And because your primary sensory organs, your eyes, your ears, your sense of direction are all oriented forward, the brain places that marker just behind the eyes, giving you the strong impression that you are located there. Even though there is no physical entity sitting in that spot, no observer, no center, just a useful fiction that helps coordinate perception and action. You've been living your entire life inside this construction, navigating through a model that feels immediate and real, never noticing that the sense of being somewhere is itself part of the model, not a fundamental property of you. And the reason it feels so convincing is because it's consistent, stable, and tightly linked to your sensory inputs. But that doesn't make it true in the way you think it is. It just makes it effective. The unsettling part is not that your brain is doing something complicated that's expected. The unsettling part is that the place you thought you occupied, the vantage point you assumed was real, might not exist in the way you imagine at all. Because if that sense of location is constructed, if it depends on how sensory data is organized and interpreted, then it can, in principle, be shifted, altered, or even removed entirely. And when that happens, the question is no longer where you are in your body, but whether the idea of being located anywhere was ever the right question to begin with. Now imagine taking that carefully constructed sense of where you are and beginning to peel it away, not by argument or philosophy, but by removing the raw data your brain depends on to build it in the first place. Because if your sense of location is something assembled from sensory input, then the simplest way to test it is to slowly take that input to zero and watch what happens. And this is exactly what fascinated Richard Feynman when he walked into a laboratory in the 1950s and encountered a device designed to do something deceptively simple. A tank filled with salt water, heated precisely to match the temperature of human skin, enclosed in total darkness and complete silence, engineered so that once you are inside it, floating effortlessly, there is almost nothing left for your senses to detect. No pressure points, no sound, no light, no temperature gradient, nothing to anchor your perception. At first, nothing remarkable happens because your brain does not give up its model easily. You still feel your body, you still have a sense of your arms and legs, a vague outline of yourself suspended in space. But what you are really experiencing is inertia, the persistence of a model that was built moments before you entered the tank. And as time passes, something subtle begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that is deeply unsettling precisely because it is gradual. Your arm no longer feels exactly where you expect it to be. Then it feels distant. Then it feels undefined. And eventually you reach a point where the question, "Where is my arm?" stops making sense because there is no clear answer your brain can produce. The boundaries that once seemed so obvious, the edge between your skin and the surrounding world, begin to blur because those boundaries were never directly sensed in the way you imagine. They were inferred, constructed from pressure, temperature, proprioception, all the signals that normally reinforce the idea of a solid, contained body. And when those signals disappear, the construction starts to unravel, not catastrophically, but quietly, like a map fading, when the coordinates that support it are removed, until you find yourself in a state that is difficult to describe without slipping into metaphor, still conscious, still thinking, still undeniably present, but without a stable sense of being located anywhere in particular. This is the moment that catches you off guard, because nothing mystical has occurred. Nothing has left your body. Nothing has traveled anywhere. And yet the feeling that you are somewhere has weakened or even vanished, leaving behind a kind of awareness without position, a mind without coordinates. And the instinctive reaction to this can be fear, because so much of your identity is tied to the assumption that you exist at a specific point in space, that you are here and not there, inside and not outside. But what the tank reveals is that this distinction depends entirely on the continuous flow of sensory information. And when that flow is interrupted, the distinction itself becomes unstable. Feynman did not interpret this as something mystical or supernatural. He saw it as a demonstration, almost an experiment performed on his own perception, showing that the feeling of having a body located in space is not a fundamental property of consciousness, but a product of ongoing computation, something your brain maintains moment by moment using whatever data it can gather. And when that data disappears, the computation no longer has enough constraints to produce a clear result. So it doesn't produce one. And what remains is not the loss of consciousness, but the loss of location, and that is the critical point. Because it forces a distinction that most people never consider. Consciousness can persist even when the sense of where you are collapses, which means the where was never essential to consciousness in the first place. It was part of the content, not the container, part of the model, not the observer. And once you see that, even briefly, even in a dark tank with nothing to hold on to, the idea that you are a fixed entity sitting inside your body begins to feel less like a fact and more like a habit your brain has been practicing for as long as you can remember. Now let's make this even more concrete, because up to this point you could still argue that what happens in a dark isolation tank is extreme, unusual, something far removed from everyday experience. But the real surprise is how easily your brain can be manipulated under completely ordinary conditions, without darkness, without silence, without anything dramatic at all. Just a simple setup that reveals something deeply unsettling about what you call your body. And I want you to picture this carefully, because the power of it lies in how simple it is. You sit at a table, your real hand is placed out of sight, hidden behind a screen, and in front of you, in full view, is a robohand, shaped and colored to look convincingly human, positioned exactly where your real hand might be, close enough to feel plausible, but not actually connected to you in any physical sense. Now the experiment begins, and this is where your brain starts doing what it always does. Trying to make sense of incoming signals, a researcher takes two brushes and begins stroking both hands at the same time. Your real hand, which you cannot see, and the rubber hand, which you can, the strokes are synchronized perfectly, sans rythme, sans direction, same timing. And at first nothing seems strange. You are aware that one is real and one is not, intellectually, that the rubber hand is just an object. But your brain is not operating on your intellectual understanding. It is operating on patterns, correlations, consistency across sensory channels. And within seconds, sometimes less than a minute, something begins to shift. You start to feel the touch where you see it, not where your real hand actually is. The visual input and the tactile input line up so precisely that your brain fuses them into a single event. And the simplest explanation it can generate, the one that best fits the data, is that the hand you are seeing must be your hand, because why else would the sensations match so perfectly? And once that inference is made, it doesn't stay abstract. It becomes embodied. You begin to experience the rubber hand as part of yourself, not metaphorically, but directly as if it belongs to you, in the same way your real hand does. The real test comes when the illusion is challenged, when the researcher suddenly threatens the rubber hand, perhaps with a needle or a hammer, something sharp, something dangerous. And despite everything you think you know, despite the fact that you understand the setup, your body reacts, you flinch, your heart rate spikes, your nervous system responds as if something real is about to happen to you. Not to the object on the table, but to you, because at that moment, the distinction has collapsed. The rubber hand has been incorporated into your body's schema, the internal model your brain uses to define what belongs to you and what does not. What this reveals is not just that your brain can be fooled, but that the very idea of ownership when it comes to your body is not hardwired in the way you might assume. It is not a fixed property stamped onto your limbs at birth. It is something inferred, constructed dynamically from the integration of sensory signals, visual, tactile, proprioceptive, all combined into a coherent story about what is yours. And that story can be rewritten surprisingly quickly if the right conditions are met, if the correlations are strong enough, if the timing is precise enough. If the brain finds a better explanation for the data it is receiving, and once you accept that, even reluctantly, even with some resistance, it becomes difficult to maintain the idea that your body is a clearly defined, stable entity that you simply inhabit. Because what counts as your body depends on how your brain organizes information, not on some intrinsic boundary that cannot be crossed. The edges are softer than they appear, more negotiable, more dependent on context than you would like to believe. And the feeling that something is part of you, that it belongs to you, is not a guarantee of truth. It is a conclusion your brain has reached based on the evidence available to it at that moment. It doesn't matter that the hand is made of rubber. It doesn't matter that it is not connected to your nervous system. What matters is that the signals align well enough to support a single interpretation. And your brain, always trying to simplify, always trying to unify, chooses the interpretation that makes the most sense of the data, even if that means redefining the boundaries of your own body in the process, leaving you with a realization that is difficult to shake once it settles in. That the body you feel yourself to be is not something you simply have, but something your brain is continuously constructing, adjusting, and, when necessary, redefining if the rubber hand illusion makes you uneasy, because it shows that your brain can quietly redefine what belongs to your body. Then the next step pushes that instability even further. Not just changing what you feel as part of yourself, but shifting where you feel you are altogether. And this is where things stop being merely strange and start becoming deeply disorienting. Because now we are no longer talking about a misplaced limb or a confused boundary. We are talking about the apparent relocation of the self itself, something that most people assume is fixed, anchored, inseparable from the body they inhabit. In a series of experiments conducted by neuroscientists in the early 2000s, participants were placed in controlled environments where their sensory inputs could be carefully manipulated, not removed like in the isolation tank, but rearranged in a very precise and deliberate way, and the setup was deceptively simple. The person would wear virtual reality goggles connected to a camera positioned a few feet behind them, so instead of seeing the world from their usual perspective, they would see their own body from the outside, as if they were standing behind themselves, looking at their back, watching their own physical form occupy space in front of them. At first, this is just unusual, a novel visual experience, but not enough to break the brain's model of self-location, because vision alone is not dominant enough to override everything else. The body is still felt from within. The tactile signals still originate from the chest, the arms, the skin. And so the brain maintains its usual conclusion that I am here inside the body, looking outward, even if the visual input is somewhat confusing. But then the experiment introduces a critical manipulation, the same kind of synchronized correlation that made the rubber hand illusion work, but now applied to the entire body. A researcher uses a stick to gently touch the participant's chest, which they cannot see directly, while at the same time another stick is moved in front of the camera, appearing in the virtual perspective to touch the space just below where the participant sees their own body from behind. And the timing is exact. Every physical sensation on the chest is matched perfectly with the visual cue of being touched at the camera's location, not at the body's location. And once again, the brain is faced with a problem it must solve, two streams of information that should not align, but do. Tactile sensation here, visual confirmation there. And the brain does what it always does. It chooses the simplest, most coherent explanation available. Within seconds, something remarkable happens. participants begin to report a shift, not just in what they feel, but in where they feel themselves to be. They no longer experience themselves as located inside their physical body. They feel as if they are positioned at the location of the camera, a few feet behind, looking at their own body as an object in front of them. And this is not a vague metaphorical description. It is a genuine perceptual change, supported by behavioral responses and brain imaging data, showing that regions associated with self-location, particularly the temporal parietal junction, adjust their activity to reflect this new inferred position. What this demonstrates with striking clarity is that your sense of where you are is not anchored to your body in any absolute way. It is assigned, computed, continuously updated based on the integration of sensory signals, and when those signals are manipulated in a consistent and convincing manner, your brain is willing to relocate the reference point it calls you, not because anything has physically moved, but because the model has changed. The internal map has been redrawn to better fit the data it is receiving. The idea that you are inside your body begins to look less like a fact and more like a default setting, a stable configuration that works under normal conditions, but one that can be altered when those conditions are disrupted. And the implication is difficult to ignore. If your brain can place you behind your eyes, and then place you in a rubber hand, and then place you several feet outside your own body, all based on how sensory information is correlated, then the location you experience as yourself is not something inherent, not something fixed, but something assigned moment by moment as part of a larger process of interpretation. People didn't actually leave their bodies in these experiments. Nothing traveled. Nothing detached. Nothing crossed any boundary. What changed was the brain's best guess about where here is. And once that guess shifts, even slightly, the entire sense of self shifts with it. Because the self, as you experience it, is inseparable from that reference point, from that continuously updated position in the model your brain constructs. And when that position moves, the feeling of being you moves with it, as effortlessly and as convincingly as if it had always been there. At this point, you might feel like something essential has been loosened, because if your sense of location can dissolve in darkness, attach itself to a rubber hand, or shift a few feet behind your body with the right sensory cues, then the natural question is no longer where you are, but what exactly it is that you think is being located in the first place. And this is where the discussion has to change direction. Because as long as you keep thinking of consciousness as a thing, something like an object sitting somewhere inside you, you will keep searching for its position, trying to point to it, trying to say it's here, when in fact the entire problem may come from treating it as the wrong kind of entity altogether. Think about something simple, something physical, like a fire. You can point to a fire and say where it is. You can indicate the space it occupies, the region where the flames are visible. But if I ask you where burning is, not the fire itself, but the process of combustion, the chemical reaction that sustains it, you run into a different kind of question. Because burning is not a thing that sits in space the way a log or a flame does. It is an activity, a transformation, something that happens rather than something that exists as a separate object. And while you can say it is occurring in a particular place, you cannot isolate it as a distinct entity with its own location independent of the system that produces it. Consciousness is much closer to burning than it is to a physical object. Because what you call your mind, your awareness, your experience, is not a thing hidden somewhere in your head, waiting to be discovered. It is a process an ongoing pattern of activity generated by the interactions of billions of neurons exchanging signals, forming dynamic networks that constantly change over time, and asking where consciousness is, in the same sense that you might ask where your hand is a category mistake, because you are trying to assign a location to something that does not have one in that way. You can, of course, point to the brain. You can say that neural activity happens in specific regions. That visual processing occurs in the occipital lobe, that auditory processing happens elsewhere. The different aspects of perception and cognition are distributed across the cortex and deeper structures, and all of that is true, but none of those locations contain the experience as a separate object. There is no single place you could open up and find the color red, or the feeling of being you, or the sense of presence that seems so immediate and undeniable, because those are not objects stored somewhere. They are patterns emerging from coordinated activity across many regions at once. This becomes even clearer when you consider how fragmented the underlying processes actually are. Different features of what you perceive are handled in different parts of the brain. Color in one area, motion in another, shape somewhere else, sound in entirely different circuits. And yet what you experience is not a scattered collection of disconnected properties. You experience a unified scene, a coherent world, as if everything has been brought together into a single point of awareness. But there is no such point, no central stage where it all comes together. No inner observer watching a complete picture. What exists instead is a distributed system whose activity gives rise to the impression of unity without ever being centralized. So when you ask where your mind is, you are already assuming that it must be somewhere, that it must occupy a position in space the way objects do. But the more accurate way to think about it is that your mind is what your brain is doing, not something separate from it, not something contained within it like a passenger inside a vehicle, but the activity itself, the pattern of interactions that generates experience. And patterns do not reside in a single point. They are defined by relationships, by coordination, by structure over time, rather than by position in space. Once you begin to see it this way, the earlier illusions stop being surprising and start becoming inevitable. Of course, your sense of location can shift because location is part of the content your brain generates, not the container in which consciousness sits. Of course, your body can feel like it changes because ownership is something inferred, not something fixed. And of course, there is no single place you can point to and say, that is where I am. Because the I you are trying to locate is not a thing that can be pinned down, but an activity that is constantly unfolding, moment by moment, as long as the underlying processes continue. By now, the idea that your mind is not a single thing in a single place has probably started to feel less abstract and more unavoidable. But there is still one last illusion holding everything together. The quiet assumption that even if the processes are distributed, even if different parts of your brain handle different tasks, there must still be some central point where it all comes together. Some internal stage where the final experience appears unified, coherent, belonging to one single you. And this assumption is so deeply ingrained that it rarely gets questioned, because your experience feels unified. It feels like one continuous stream, one perspective, one observer. But when you look at what the brain is actually doing, that unity becomes much harder to justify, because perception is not assembled in one place. It is constructed across many regions simultaneously. Color is processed in one network, motion in another, shape in yet another, sound somewhere else entirely. And these processes occur in parallel distributed across the cortex without any obvious central hub that gathers them into a single package. And yet somehow you never experience fragments. You never see color detached from shape or motion, separated from objects. You experience a red ball bouncing and making a sound as one coherent event, as if there were a hidden center stitching everything together. This is what neuroscientists call the binding problem. And it is not just a technical issue. It is a direct challenge to the idea of a centralized self, because if there is no single location where all the information converges, then there is no obvious place where you could be sitting, observing the final result. There is no inner theater, no control room, no executive agent watching a complete picture. What exists instead is a network of processes that synchronize, align in timing, and through that coordination create the impression of unity without ever producing a single point of convergence. And if that already feels unstable, the situation becomes even more striking when you look at what happens when the connections between those distributed processes are physically altered. Because in certain medical cases, particularly in the treatment of severe epilepsy, surgeons have cut the corpus callosum, the bundle of fibers that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain, effectively isolating the two halves from each other. And what emerges from this is not a slightly impaired version of the same mind, but something far stranger, two semi-independent streams of consciousness operating within the same skull. Each hemisphere continues to process information, but without direct communication, they begin to behave in ways that suggest separate perspectives. The left hemisphere, which is typically responsible for language, can describe what it sees when information is presented to the right visual field, while the right hemisphere, which does not have direct access to language, can respond to information presented to the left visual field through actions, pointing, selecting, indicating, and in some cases, the two sides can even produce conflicting behaviors. One hand reaching for something while the other resists, as if two different intentions were competing within a single body. What makes this so unsettling is not just the behavior, but what it implies about the structure of the self, because if a single brain can give rise to two distinct centers of awareness simply by severing a connection, then the idea of a single indivisible you begins to look less like a fundamental truth and more like a contingent outcome of how well these processes are integrated. Unity is not guaranteed. It is constructed, maintained by communication between parts that could, under different conditions, function independently. The question then becomes unavoidable. If the unity of your experience depends on coordination across distributed systems, if it can be altered, divided, or disrupted by changes in connectivity, then what exactly is the you that feels so stable, so singular, so continuous? Because what the evidence suggests is not a fixed entity at the center, but a dynamic pattern of integration, a temporary alignment of processes that, when functioning together, give rise to the impression of a single self, but do not require one to exist as a separate, centralized object. Two hands can move with different intentions. Two streams of awareness can unfold in parallel, and yet under normal conditions, you experience none of that division, only the smooth surface of a unified perspective, which makes it tempting to believe that unity is fundamental, when in fact it may be nothing more than a fragile agreement between systems that, given the right conditions, can come apart without warning. If you follow everything we've uncovered to its logical end, without stepping back, without softening it, without trying to preserve the comforting assumptions you started with, then what begins to emerge is not just a different understanding of the mind, but a complete shift in what you take yourself to be. Because once you accept that your sense of location is constructed, that your body ownership is inferred, that your perspective can be reassigned, that your experience is distributed rather than centralized, then the idea of a fixed, stable self, something that exists independently of all this, becomes increasingly difficult to maintain, not because it has been disproven in a single dramatic moment, but because every layer you examine fails to support it. You are not a point in space, not behind your eyes, not inside your skull, not anchored anywhere in the way you instinctively imagine, and you are not a single unified observer watching a complete picture from a hidden vantage point. What you call you is the result of processes aligning, integrating, coordinating just well enough to produce the impression of a continuous identity, a stable perspective, a coherent subject moving through the world, and that impression is powerful, persistent, deeply convincing, but it is not the kind of thing that exists independently of the system that generates it. It is what the system does when it is functioning in a particular way. This becomes impossible to ignore when you consider how easily it can change, damage to specific regions of the brain, can alter personality, shift preferences, erase memories, transform behavior in ways that feel like a different person has taken over, not because something external has entered, but because the underlying processes have been modified. And if those processes are what you are, then any change to them is a change to you, not to a container, not to a vessel, but to the pattern itself, the thing you have been calling me. The implications extend further than most people are comfortable admitting, because if you are a pattern rather than a thing, then questions about identity become less clear-cut. If the pattern were copied, reproduced exactly in another medium, would that still be you or something else entirely? And if the pattern gradually changes over time, as it inevitably does, at what point does it stop being the same pattern? These are not questions with easy answers. And even someone like Richard Feynman would not pretend otherwise. He would simply acknowledge that the problem is deeper than our current concepts can fully resolve. And then there is the question people tend to avoid, the one that sits quietly behind all the others. What happens when the processes stop? When the activity ceases? When the brain no longer maintains the pattern that gives rise to experience? Because if there is no separate entity, no observer independent of the system, no soul detached from the machinery, then there is no place for you to go. No continuation in another location. No hidden layer where the self persists unchanged. What ends is not a container being emptied, but a process coming to completion, a pattern dissolving back into the physical substrate that once sustained it. This is often framed as something bleak, something unsettling. But there is another way to see it that does not rely on denial or comforting illusions, because the same insight that removes the idea of a fixed self also reveals something far more unusual, that for a brief period of time, matter organizes itself in such a way that it becomes aware, that it models itself and its environment, that it generates an internal perspective, a point of view that feels like being someone, and that this is not happening somewhere inside a hidden chamber, but across a vast dynamic network of interactions that, for a while, hold together. You are not a thing moving through space, not an object with a defined location and a permanent identity. You are an event, a process, a pattern of activity unfolding in time, shaped by biology, by experience, by interaction with the world. And the feeling of being a single, continuous self is part of that pattern, not something that exists outside it, not something that can be separated from it and placed somewhere else. And once that becomes clear, even if only partially, even if it resists full acceptance, the question of where your mind is begins to dissolve, because it was never the right question to begin with. You're not located anywhere in the way you once believed. Not because you are hidden somewhere unexpected, but because what you are does not fit into the category of things that have locations at all. And what remains, after all the assumptions have been stripped away, is something both simpler and stranger than the idea you started with. A temporary configuration of matter and energy that, for a short time, is able to recognize itself as existing without ever needing a place to be.